Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to talk in our series on world literature. Friends, so far we have conducted numerous sessions under the series and we have tried to give you the deep insight into the various lectures. Friends, today we are going to talk on 20th century fiction, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is a retired professor of English from Delhi University, and through him we always get in-depth knowledge on various topics and issues of English. Friends, we know that you might have lots and lots of questions while listening to Professor Anand Prakash, so you can talk to us through our toll-free number and ask questions from Professor Prakash. Friends, for contacting us, you can just dial through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. All dear friends who are watching us right now, you are requested to call us in the last 10 minutes of the lecture, as well as you are requested to ask questions relevant to the topic only. Now I would like to welcome our guest Professor Prakash once again. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Geetika, and welcome viewers. And we are running this series called 20th Century Literature, and we'll be discussing various aspects of this trend that has emerged only lately in the middle of the 20th century, to be precise. We've had discussions regarding what world literature is and also the critical approaches that emerged in the last century, and that might also emerge later, and they are of course in the realm of potentiality in the 21st century. Today's topic is 20th century fiction, as announced by Geetika, and 20th century fiction is a very rich area, very fertile area, perhaps the strongest area in our time, because poetry has been old, has been having sources in old reality. Drama has been as ancient as the hills, but so far as fiction is concerned, this is relatively young genre, a young field of literary expression. And in the 20th century in particular, certain trends of fiction came up, and these drew attention not merely of the critics but also of the lay reader. And I'm not going to cover the whole of the 20th century fiction, because it's a very vast area, and there are other scholars in our series participating in the series as experts. So they will be covering certain other areas of 20th century fiction. Today I will confine myself basically to stream of consciousness as a trend in 20th century fiction. Then I will come to realism, and finally I will take up what is called magic or magical realism. So the lecture is divided into three parts, and the first part is stream of consciousness. You know that in the 20th century, the background of the earlier century was mainly devoted to the fiction where descriptions were important. Descriptions of society, descriptions of experience of human beings, descriptions of one human being talking to another and entering a relationship, institutions of the society of the time, they were reflected in the 20th century, and stream of consciousness suddenly emerged in the early part of the 20th century. I say this because in the 19th century, stream of consciousness would not be heard of except by a few people. People had drawn attention to the reality that existed in the human mind. Romantic poets were there who were talking about their own individual experience at the level of imagination. They talked about imagination and fantasy, but they were poets. Fiction took a long time to come to take advantage of the reality that belonged to the mind of the human being. Mostly the 19th century writers were talking about the society of the time, how human beings are pressed hard by social situations, by institutions, They were the topic of 19th century fiction. But in the 20th century, this thing emerged, which is called the stream of consciousness fiction. What exactly is stream of consciousness fiction? Obviously, the more important word in this particular expression is consciousness. It is not society. It is not tragedy. It is not comedy. It is not something else. It is the human being who is thinking, who is becoming conscious, who is relatively more or less conscious at a particular moment, and then that consciousness develops and grows further. So, don't you think, viewers, that this is a new area of literature so far as the early 20th century is concerned? People will now start talking. If they wrote fiction, they would start talking about the mind of the human being and how the mind functions, and what does the eye see, and how does the mind interpret it. The person will always be conscious, the person at the center of fiction. It might be a character, it might be 2 characters, 3 characters, and mainly it's one character, because human mind is so vast, and consciousness is such a well defined area in the behavior of a human being, that if you go to another human being and want to be acquainted with his or her consciousness, then the attention of the text, of the literary fictional text, will be divided and distracted. So, generally it's one human being who is aware of what is going on inside him, what he has seen, how he is reacting to it, whether he is happy or unhappy. If he is unhappy or happy, then why is it that he is happy or unhappy? How does he express it unto himself? So, see, so many words I used. I used the word consciousness, I used the word self, I used the word happiness, unhappiness. All these words revolve around the individual who is at the center of fiction at that time. And one can ask even this question as to what is consciousness. Consciousness in lay terms is something that is a kind of mental waking up. Your mind is mostly asleep, my mind is mostly asleep. I am basically obeying the diktats of the society of the time. I am doing my duty. I have certain morals to observe, and those morals were told to me by somebody else, and I started gearing myself in that direction, which means I had never any time to think of myself. Always I was just meeting the requirements of society. So, this is how fiction till the early 20th century worked for. But then human beings became conscious about themselves, and they started going inwardly into their own minds, and their self-consciousness showed up as a kind of a problem that fiction will solve. So, this gave rise to what can be called the stream of consciousness fiction, that the person would be conscious about oneself, would be thinking of one's emotions, should be thinking of the language that that person would use in order to capture the emotions. So, there is a kind of self-reflexivity, that there is a kind of thinking about one's own language, one's own words, and from words you immediately go to thoughts, because language and thoughts come together, and language is always is a kind of couching of thoughts. So, thoughts and language are inseparable. So, the moment you become conscious about language, that very moment you become conscious about your thoughts. And if that is so, then how do you come to terms with yourself as a thinking person? So, imagine that the fiction now started talking about these things. So, viewers, if you have not read 20th century fiction of the kind that is called this stream of consciousness fiction, then you would be slightly surprised as to what one is reading, what you are reading, what I am reading. And therefore, one should know that this trend of the person thinking about himself within his own mind, this is what 20th century stream of consciousness fiction is. Now, for the second question that you might ask from yourself and ask from me would be as to what are the sources in the 19th century that gave rise in the early 20th century to 20th century stream of consciousness fiction. This is a question, think about it. I'll of course share my thinking with you here, and I would say that in the 19th century a large number of discoveries a large number of specific areas of study. They came up, and these areas also included the area of the mind. You have towards the end of the 19th century, and who is also there in the early 20th century, a person called Freud. And Freud, talks about consciousness. He talks about imagination. He talks about dreams. He talks about fantasy. He doesn't talk about social structures. He does not talk about equality and inequality in society. He talks about consciousness. He talks about the mind. How does the mind function? Now, before I tell you further about stream of consciousness and fiction, let me tell you that Freud was taking the attention of a reader away from the belief systems that one held, like religion, like morality. He was explaining in terms of the mind, in terms of these responses, human attitude to religion and morality. And he would explain. Now, these things were not explained. Moral was moral, immoral was immoral. And they would be very broadly defined by religious preachers, by people who were given entirely to religion. But Freud took this area, in fact snatched this area away from the grip of religion and morality, even ethics. And he said, no, I'll explain in my own way as a human being, with respect to human beings as they think in their own minds in the life that they lead. So this was a departure by people like Freud, and Freud was a scientist. Freud was not a literary writer, he was not a poet, he was not a literary critic. He wanted to study the functioning of the human mind the same way as some other scientists study the functioning of nature, the role of nature, the working of nature, the rules that nature follows. So they are called scientists, but there can be a scientist who would like to understand the human mind, and Freud was such a thinker, and he became a rage in the 19th century. You remember that there are three thinkers, and all are in the 19th century. You have this person, you have Karl Marx, for instance, then you have Darwin, and the third is Freud. Freud comes later, but then Darwin once again starts emphasizing the evolution of life, and says that human life is rooted in the life of the planet, and there was life before human beings came. This was a new thing. People were shocked to hear that the human mind or the human being emerged from nature. But this is what the person said, Darwin. And Karl Marx was talking about the economic life, the social life, producing a human being, and human being in return producing these things. And Freud then came up and he said, okay, I'll explain to you the way the human mind functions. Now, these things spread in the 19th century, and as the 20th century came, and people started becoming more and more involved in struggles outside in the world, also within the human being, as I already explained. So that is, I think, the background. Freud was the background. The study of the mind in the hands of Freud was the background of the stream of consciousness fiction that was there in the early 20th century. I will now explain to you for a little while as to what exactly stream of consciousness focuses upon. This is a sentence that I am carrying with me. It's a narrative technique in non-dramatic fiction intended to render the flow of myriad impressions. So the fiction talks about myriad impressions, different impressions, various impressions. So fiction does not talk about now the social situations, but talks about the impressions. Whatever I see, then I carry that impression of the seeing thing, of the thing that is seen in my mind, and then I express those impressions. And those impressions are visual, whatever I see, that I depict. Auditory, whatever I hear, that I carry in my fiction. Physical, whatever comfort or discomfort, pain or pleasure that I feel inside myself, that also is externalized, is put on the paper through words in the work of fiction. Then associative. What is associative? Well, I associate myself with somebody else. I think about something, and that thinking is associated with something else in life. I am thinking of mind, and mind thinks of emotions, and emotions think of happiness. Now just see, thinking of one thing leads to another within its own area. That is called association. So, with association of one word with another, you start thinking of that and the travel and the movement and the journey from one point to another. This is captured graphically by the stream of consciousness fiction in the 20th century. So, associative, then subliminal. Nobody talked about the subliminal. What is subliminal? Subliminal is which is there somewhere in my mind, but I don't want to express it. I have the desire, I want to say something, but then I don't want to say it openly because it might be hurting somebody else. Therefore, I start grumbling, I start muttering, and sometimes I don't mutter or grumble. I can just think of something else in my mind and I curb it. I don't say it. That is subliminal. Subliminal, which is hidden under the surface, and the moment I take the lid off of morality or ethics, that very time this subliminal content in my mind, this will come up. So, mostly a kind of madness that people suppress and say that others will laugh at them or others will will not take them seriously. So, if there is an element of madness in a person, that is generally kept under the ropes. So, but in literature, that when you are alone, when you are talking about your own self, then that subliminal element also comes up. In fact, in poetry, what is important is the subliminal. Openly nobody says anything, nobody talks about love, but then if one sees a woman or a woman sees a man and they have a kind of a desire for each other and they don't want to express because society will not permit it, therefore, one will take to poetry, one will take to songs. So, love is best expressed in poetry and songs. Now, all this is subliminal, but that is only at the level of poetry. When it comes to the prose, the narrative prose, the prose in which there is a story, and there the character starts thinking and then starts muttering and then says something that he would not generally say, that is subliminal, and this is now a subject of prose writing also. So, these are the things that the stream of consciousness fiction will focus upon for appeal to the reader, that impinge on the consciousness of an individual. Consciousness of the individual generally is to be recognized as something formal. Most of us behave formally in life, but then sometimes the individual has to feel that he is suppressing his own inner intentions. So, the consciousness is feeling that pressure from the society of the time, and then he says, then the writer says, forms part of awareness along with the trend of his rational thoughts. So, one does not talk only about rational thoughts, but also about a part which is beyond it. This is what stream of consciousness fiction is. I get up in the morning and then I start preparing for the day, and during that period I start thinking of many other things in life. In those 2 hours in the morning when I prepare myself, I start thinking of the whole day, and when I say that okay, I will meet this person, then I start thinking about his past, about the things that he did or did not do. And then from that person I move to the third person, because that is the association. This person was a friend of somebody else, and that friend in fact introduced me to him. Therefore, first I to think of myself, then I think of the person I am going to meet, and then I think of the person who introduced me to him. So, imagine association is moving in the mind, and all this is happening where? Not in life, not vis-a-vis other people, not with people at home with whom I interact. It is happening within my own mind, and I can control it there. So, that is what stream of consciousness fiction is, that you think, then you think more, then you think about the association, and from association you get some happiness or unhappiness. That unhappiness or happiness then reminds you of something else 10 years ago. So, what has happened? You are at the table, you are taking your breakfast, you are preparing for the day, you have a plan in your mind, and in this course you are thinking of so many things that might have happened 10 years ago. This journey in one's own mind while taking breakfast, this journey from the moment that one is sitting at the table to the point where 10 years ago you think of all those things, this is happening within your mind, nobody knows about it. Even the person sitting next to you at the table does not know that you are thinking of all these things. But the writer then say, okay, the writer says then, I will capture it, I'll make it a part of fiction and I'll write this way. That is stream of consciousness fiction. So it will, the whole thing will happen in the mind, and that will then be given words, so that one expresses oneself not through the description of what one does, but through the description of what one sees in one's own consciousness. This is exactly the point that is being made regarding it. And then, you know, there is a word that is used for this fiction, and that is called interior monologue. Interior monologue. Interior, inside, internal. Inside my mind something is happening, and a kind of monologue is taking place. Monologue is one voice. I'm just I'm talking to myself. That's a monologue. If I'm talking to somebody else, it's a dialogue. Dialogue is with someone else. But when I'm conversing with myself, when I'm talking to myself, then it's a monologue. And in one word, if one has to express the meaning of stream of consciousness fiction, one can say that stream of consciousness fiction is a kind of internal monologue. So this you have to keep this in mind, and this monologue continues. In fact, it's very interesting to see, you know, in the context of this fiction, that other novels of the realist phase, I'll discuss them later in the lecture, other novels would sometimes take 150 pages, sometimes 200 pages, maybe sometimes 500 or 600 pages also. But when it came to internal monologue, then a description of an hour spent with oneself in one's mind might take 1,000 pages, because in that hour one has gone over different areas, different kinds of things, and then one continues more and more. Then this is the main person in English fiction and in world fiction also to that matter. We have basically this person called James Joyce. He is a giant, he is the pillar of stream of consciousness fiction, and his two novels particularly, you know, took our attention. One was Ulysses, that old Greek character. He talks about him, but then he starts thinking of somebody else in the 20th century. And then the other novel that he wrote was Finnegan's Wake. So these were the two novels that were there. Then Virginia Woolf is an important writer, and this trend was not confined merely to English fiction, but was also there in the other parts of Europe at that time. So this it is scattered all over the world also, because this influence of the mind study that started in the 19th century started affecting and influencing peoples all over the world. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to be with us as we are back after a short break, and we are going to discuss more. Till then, be with us. Thank you. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on 20th century fiction, and for the discussion on the topic we have with us in our studios Professor Anand Prakash. Professor Anand Prakash is a retired professor of English, and through him we always try to extract more because he has always the best to give us, and we are always enlightened through him. Friends, let's enlighten ourselves once again as we are going to discuss more on 20th century fiction through him. If you wish to ask questions from Professor Prakash on today's topic, then do call us to our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. Friends, you are requested to call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture only. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Professor Prakash, once again. Hello, sir. Welcome back to the session.
Thank you, Gitika, and welcome again to the lecture. And we have covered so far the stream of consciousness fiction. And now we'll go to another area of fiction in the 20th century, and that evolved in a specific manner. It was a continuation also of the 19th century, but it continued and experimented with many things in the 20th century. And this trend is called realism. You have heard this word earlier in other lectures, in other discussions. Literature generally and fiction particularly involves with what is called social reality. And that reality is the theme, is the question, is the problem that literature and fiction in particular engages with. So, what is realism? I'll talk briefly about realism in the 20th century context, and I will acquaint you with the ideas that are connected with realism. The word is very simple, it is real, but the moment you say something real, that very moment there are problems in thinking, in ideology, because nobody is certain as to what the real means, what the real implies. My real may be different from somebody else's real. My own real 5 years ago would be different from my real today, and who knows, after 5 years there will be another real that is coming up. So, what is real? In fact, nobody can give any specific, any particular, any definitive answer to what is real. Whether faith is real, whether relations are real, the ethical conduct is real, whether struggle in society is real, strain is real, happiness is real. What is real? In fact, this is the area which is explored by the fiction of the 19th and 20th centuries. In the 19th century, people, generally, as if the whole thing was accepted, talked about their own surroundings. They talked about the city in which they lived. They talked about the village in which they lived. They talked about characters who inhabited the cities and the villages. They talked about the laws of the society of the time, the conventions of the society of the time. All that was real. In the 20th century, people started thinking as to what exactly is real, and how the real can also be fictionalized. The moment I say that real can be fictionalized, in fact I am saying something which does not make sense easily. The real is not fiction. Fiction is the opposite of real. Real is there, tangible, you can touch it, you can see it, you can feel it. That is what real is. And fiction is all made up. Fiction is all that you write, only words. So, where is the reality in the word? So, just see that when you say realistic fiction, that very moment problems occur. Now, I will just read out this idea from the point of view of another person. Let us say in this case I'll talk about this. There is a gentleman called T. Murphy. This is what he says about the real: escaping any formalization. What is formalization? That you have a form, you talk formally. But if you talk formally, then you miss the real, because the real is hidden somewhere. Real is very spontaneous. Real is something that can be touched and felt. But when you are formal, when you are aware of what you are saying, when you are aware of the words, when you are aware of the audience, when you are aware of the neighborhood, then you don't talk about the real, then you talk about the formal. So he says that this person, no, not Murphy, but Lupin, this person says that escaping the formal is important, then only you will get the real. So, he says the real is the set where truth, meaning and sense are to be. Very high words, philosophical words. If you are talking about philosophy, then literature takes straight away some kind of a jump. Truth, do we know what truth is? Meaning, do we understand the implications of meaning? And sense. But all these things, are connected with the real. So, let us say that when we are face to face with the real, then we are aware of the truth, we are aware of the meaning, we are aware of the sense. Why? Because the formal part has been taken away. This is one idea of real. I will not go further into this, because then it will be a domain of philosophy and I do not want to go into it. Then the other person, I was quoting him earlier, T. Murphy, this is what he says about the real, and he uses the word real subsumption. What is real subsumption? Try to understand the word subsume. Real subsumption is something that reality is actually adjusted with, reality is absorbed. So, there is something real, something is happening at the level of politics, at the level of political reality, and people do not understand, I do not understand, but then after 10 days I start understanding it. That is subsuming. So, subsuming the real, that is important. And who does the subsuming of the real? Fiction does the subsuming of the real, in which capitalist relations exercise hegemony in society. You know that at the higher level it is always buying and selling, but when there is a lower level, there is a level of friendship, there is a level of relationship between a father and a daughter, then that sense of the capitalist exploitation, that disappears. I think it takes a long time for capitalist exploitation to enter the area of the family. In the family, people have a kind of connection at the feeling level, at the level of emotions. They don't bother about buying and selling. But there comes a time when this is subsumed also, the normal life is subsumed, and things are at that point of time taken from the upper reality down to the lower level. This is what is is important in the context of the real. Do novels talk about it? Do novels tell us that that this kind of subsuming is there in society, in life? This is one question, and the realist fiction will discuss this question. I will give examples in order to make this clear. There are many things in life that I don't understand. I am lost. I am confused. People come and ask a question and I give one answer. Then they ask a counter question to which I have no answer. Why is it happening? Because in fact I am at that point of time not thinking about the real. I am only thinking about my impressions. But these impressions have to lead me somewhere, and those impressions lead me to a conclusion. This is what is done by individuals all the time. Can this also be done by writing? I think writing helps us. That is why we read novels. In order to understand life in Delhi, there are two ways to understand life in Delhi. One is to live here for 10, 20, 50, 15 years. The other is to read a novel about Delhi. The second option is that you will come to know about many people who lived in Delhi, who had their experiences here, and who talked in one way. They differed with one another. One person proved the other person wrong. So, you know that one person was right, the other was wrong, and you know the reason also. So, these people who live in Delhi, these people talk about Delhi, and they differ with each other, and some are wrong and some are right. But when you are reading in the novel their conduct, living actually in society in Delhi, that very moment you will start understanding the situation in Delhi. So, don't you think that this is something very interesting, that in order to understand reality, you move out of the real life and go into the pages of fiction. This is what realism does. So, realistic fiction tells us about the society of the time in such a manner that we understand the truth. This is called realistic fiction. I will not go beyond this, and I will straight away from this idea about the real go to the question of what Lukács, the famous philosopher of realistic fiction in world literature, says. He talks about a German word. The word is Weltanschauung. What does it mean? He calls it ideology. Ideology, system of ideas. I have one idea, I have another idea, I have a third idea. All these things are in sequence. First is this idea, then there is a higher idea, then there is still higher idea, and all ideas are interconnected. This is ideology. In fact, I should ask this question from myself, and you should ask this question from yourself, whether you have an ideology. Please ask this question, and you will realize that whatever you did in terms of thinking in the last 3 days, there were many words that were recurring again and again in your thought. It is these words, if you see them in a system, then that is what is ideology. Okay. The writer has an ideology. This ideology the writer transfers to his writing, and that ideology can be wrong, can be right, but he is transferring it to the story, to the narrative in the book. Now, because he has an ideology of the kind that is taking the real into consideration, he will write realistic fiction. I am also saying, when I say this, that the writer expresses one's intention in one's fiction. If I want to write, if I want to prove something good, then I write. But fiction is something where you imagine also. Fiction is something where you give some kind of a chance to the opposite person to talk, and you make two people talk, and these two people have different ideas about reality. So it's not in your hands. It's not in my hands if I'm a writer, that I'll just take this conclusion to be happier and better than the other conclusion, because the moment I leave myself with the help of imagination in the world of the pages, that very moment things go out of my control. You must have heard many examples where the writer wanted to say something and actually ended up saying the opposite. This is possible. In fiction, this is possible, because the writer has one ideology, one system of ideas, but when that ideology is given the shape of a story, in the story some other characters start drawing more attention, which was not my intention. I remember that there are stories, there are myths in Mahabharata, in Ramayana and elsewhere, where people start enjoying some portions better. The writer wanted the one part for enjoyment of the reader, but the other part became more interesting. In Ramayana, I think one of the most interesting part is where Parshurama and Lakshman talk with each other, and there they fight with each other through words, and that's very hilarious kind of a thing. Now Valmiki or later on Tulsidas would not be thinking that this is the most important thing. They will talk about the fight between good and evil to be more important, but then one doesn't know. So from this example one can say that when you are writing a novel, in that novel things are not in your control. And then says Lukács, actually what is the novel? That is your ideology, not your personal ideology, because what gets written has an ideology of its own. That is what is realist fiction. In realist fiction, what is important is how real you actually are in your depiction, not in your intention. I say as a writer I would be realist and I write, but whatever I write doesn't convince others, which means I have failed in my mission. But what happens is that when I have written, that very moment the content becomes very close to the real. That is realism, and Lukács is talking about it. So the writer becomes realistic not merely by the intention of being realistic. The writer becomes realistic by appealing to the people in a convincing manner. He convinces the person that this is what right is, this is what real is, and this gives rise to the realistic fiction in the 20th century. So what is realistic fiction? That which makes the reader aware of his own reality, her own reality, that which takes the reader closer to the time in which one lives, that reality which is more convincing and appealing. This for him is the realistic fiction, and the examples of realistic fiction in the 20th century are the examples. You can take examples from India, you can take examples from Europe, you can take examples from America, and these realistic fictions. These fictions are important because they make us aware about the reality of the time then. For instance, there is a World War I, there is a World War II. People have written about them, and they have written from different angles. And there was a novel before these world wars occurred, written by Tolstoy. It was called War and Peace, and even though this was written before the two world wars, this became much more applicable to the fight in the 20th century's two world wars. So, see the fiction, see the range of fiction. It's written in the beginning of or at the end of the 19th century or beginning of the 20th century, and World War I occurs in 1914, and the Second World War starts in 1939. But then War and Peace as a novel becomes important in the 20th century. Why? Because even though it is written before it, it was talking about something real in society, not real in terms of talking about Napoleon, because the novel went actually further back in the early 19th century, when Napoleon on one side and England and other countries on the other, they fought. So, imagine that in reality you can travel further back, further forth. Back is War and Peace talks about the Napoleonic War. Fourth is that his novel becomes applicable to the two world wars, and even today whenever there is a war, you can read this novel and you will have new insights. This is called the range and depth of the realistic fiction. The realistic fiction talks about parameters that are hidden under the surface. What happens on the surface, what people do, talk on the surface is important, no doubt, but not very deep in its understanding. What makes us say those things, that is hidden under the surface, that is important. This is the realistic writing is not merely what you see, what you feel. Realistic writing is also that which made you feel and see in this manner. And realistic fiction then actually, if you have not read criticism, if you have not read the kind of explanation that is there about realistic fiction, then you would only say that okay, this will tell me about my society. That is not the case. It will tell us about our society. At the same time, realistic fiction will go into those areas which are not visible. Those areas are actually potential. So, in fact, this is the word that George Lukács uses, and who says that potential is a part of real. What might have happened and does not happen also is real, because it's there in the seed form. The seed is there with me, not the tree, but the seed also carries the tree. If I know the seeds, nature of the seed, then I can imagine what the tree would be like. So, this kind of metaphor of the seed, in seed form the reality is captured in the fiction, and then it starts growing further in the mind of the audience and in the times in which the writing is read, and that is what realistic fiction is for us. So, do not confuse, I should not confuse realistic fiction with the actuality of the time, but with those parts of reality also which are hidden as potentiality. So, potentiality also is a part of the real, not that only the given is real, and this is what Lukács is telling in his criticism of the fiction of the 19th and 20th centuries. The second point that he makes, and then I will shift to the third subject. The second point that he makes is that content determines form, but there is no content of which man himself is not the focal point. Content, form, man. These three have to be kept in mind if you discuss realistic fiction. Content is what is written. Form is that which is the beginning, which is the end, and the movement. And content is captured in this journey. So, the journey and the journey which is the form, and the experience which is the content, they remain together. But then he says that it does not become real if man is not at the center. Man means human being. Would you agree? I think if a writer writes as a human being. Writer writes in language. Writer writes also in a particular environment. If all these things are there, then human being is at the center. If you are not a humanist, you cannot write realistic fiction. You have to be a human being in your ideology. You should say things which cause pain. You will go into the questions why they cause pain, and then the pain should appear to be pain. It should not be a matter of no worry, or it should not be a matter of laughter. So, if human being is not at the center, if something else is at the center, then of course it is not realistic writing so far as this major 20th century Hungarian critic called Lukács is concerned. He talks about, and this is the last point I make about him, and then I shift. Abstract potentiality, what is that? After all, it's a realistic fiction that we are discussing, in which there is potentiality which is abstract. That is not acceptable. It has to be concrete. For instance, if you are talking about something that doesn't connect with us, it may be reality, but it's not a concrete reality. Concrete reality is that which is felt. Concrete reality is that absorbs us, that engages us, that takes our attention, that is popular with us, and which we live all the time. So if you write about something that happens somewhere on the moon, if you write about something that happens, on the North Pole or South Pole, which has no connection with me, it's not fiction. For a fiction to be fiction, it has to be about the human being. So content, form, and the human being at the center. This is what is realistic fiction, and this fiction was popular in the 19th century. This was quite popular in the 20th century also, but then there were debates and people started saying different things about it, and they engaged the attention. So we have friends also heard discussions about realism in other lectures. So now I shift to the third part of our discussion, and that is concerning this magical realism. Let's now the word is common. When earlier I talked about realism, and now I am talking about magical realism. What is magical realism? So far I said it should be real, but here realism is not real, it is magical. So magic element is there. What is so very interesting about magical realism, and when did it emerge? This question should be asked, and this is a typical 20th century development. In the 19th century, you don't have magical realism the way we understand the term. In the 20th century, there were writers who started talking of magical realism in order to take us away from the mundane reality, and they said so much is hidden in the same experience that you don't see, that I don't see, but it is there, and how to make it clear. This is what magical realism was. So you have a situation, let's say you are reading an episode that happened or may have happened 5,000 years ago, and this is in the domain of belief. Nobody knows it whether it actually happened or not, but there is somebody who says, okay, I'll take it seriously. Somebody flew from here, let's say, to another part of the world, and there, on the way, one felt a kind of gush of the wind, and that wind, was at that point of time because the gods were helping the person. Suppose you have this kind of a story. Somebody flies away from here. You can't fly away in the 5,000 years ago. It's not possible for a human being to fly. But some human beings flew. So let's say that they flew, and when they flew, they went to other part of the planet, and on the way they felt the gush of the wind, and then through the wind a sound came, and that sound finally became a voice, and somebody started talking to us. Suppose this is the episode that you write today. How will you write? Now there are two ways. One way is that you will not bother about the reader at all. You will say what you want to say. You just imagine the situation as if this actually happened. But in the other case, you will say, okay, this is how it's actually happening, and you can see it here. Actually happened in one case is the way you wanted to say it, but here you are saying, no, I'll stick to it, this actually happened. So somebody flew away. How does one flow away? And he shows this is how one flows away. Well, one first goes up a tree. From a tree one jumps up, then the wind takes charge and the wind throws up, and then you go still further and you say another part of the world, then you say a third part of the world, then you meet some people there, they are all already flying. Now all this is not there. It's not there in the episode. Nobody has written about it. But you start saying, if this can happen to this man, this can happen to other people also. So there might be one person who is flying away, but there are 10,000 more who are flying away, and all of them meet on the way. And when they meet, they talk in their own language. Suppose you start using a language which is today's language in the context of this episode, which happened 5,000 years ago, what is happening? This is the question. So magical realism wants to believe, wants to have you believe that what you heard was right, and then it starts giving its own logic of why it was right. So, you are caught in a kind of conundrum, in a kind of a difficulty. Should one believe it or not believe it? And if you can do that, if you can give arguments in favor of why you are right, and those arguments are scientific arguments, and nobody can believe, but then you are giving arguments. So, there is a point that you are making. So, this in a way you can say, okay, this is happening magically. This is what is magical realism. I can give an example from an Argentinian writer, Borges, to make this point. Borges in one of the short stories says that a murder happened, and in that murder this person was murdered and the other one was the murderer. Quite simple. But then he says there are 5-6 possibilities of this murder, and in one possibility is that the murder did not take place, but then somebody believed that the murder took place. So, he goes into different areas of the same episode from one point to another. In one the murder takes place, in the other person, the person who is murdered actually is not the one who was supposed to be murdered. In the third possibility, the person who murdered actually didn't murder, somebody else did. In the fourth possibility, the murder never happened. So, imagine that the same situation is being imagined in 5-6 different ways, and no way is particularly right or wrong. So, what is the author doing in this particular magical realistic sort of a short story? I think the writer at that point of time is telling you about the hidden marvelous in the mundane. Mundane is the ordinary, and in the ordinary there are certain marvelous things that are happening, and we don't know. The writer knows, and the writer creates this, and this trend emerged in the 20th century. It is called magical realism, and in fact we have a novel in India written in English by Salman Rushdie, and that is Satanic Verses, that is Midnight Children, and there he talks about the same thing. Somebody who is there 50 years ago suddenly comes today, and the person takes shape. So, what I say is that you take liberties with the with the narrative, and then you are creating a situation which is unbelievable, but you start showing it as believable, and therefore one doesn't know whether one should believe in it or not believe in it. So, anyway, we have discussed today 3 different trends of the 20th century fiction. The first trend was stream of consciousness, which took us into the mind of the protagonist, the character. The second was the realistic writing, realism, in which the potential also was a part of the real, and in the third category where the magical realism showed different aspects of reality, and all those aspects were equally right or wrong, and the writer was able to dazzle us with his narrative. So, with these 3 explanations, I am sure you would have become aware about the trends in fiction that happened in the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your precious input to the lecture. And friends, we would like to tell you all that if you wish to share your thoughts, your feedback, then do write to us at info.cec@nic.in, as well as your questions are welcome. We'll try to give answers to your questions when next time Professor Anand Prakash visits our studio. Till then, keep watching us, be with us, and yes, keep writing us. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.
Thank you.